Hello, hello, hello. Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to the first MIT Energy Initiative event of the 2017-2018 academic year. This is the first day of classes here today at MIT. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. Today's conversation is titled, "If you had $1 billion for energy-related R&D, where would you spend it?" Of course, this question is really an entry point into a larger conversation about energy every day that we talk about at MIT and across the MIT community. And we ask, how can we meet the world's growing demand for reliable, affordable energy while at the same time achieving ambitious, vital emissions reduction targets to avoid the most serious consequences of climate change? MIT's Plan for Action for Climate Change charges us with finding and advancing solutions to decarbonize the global energy system with the goal of achieving a zero-carbon energy system by the end of the century. This is a complex, technical, political, economic, and social challenge, and our view at MIT is that we stand the best chance of success if a broad range of stakeholders, from industry to government to civil society, engage with each other proactively to address it. One way that we can engage is through forums like this one, where we have the opportunity to participate in an open discussion with industry leaders about the dual energy climate challenge. This is an interesting time for this conversation. The CEO of Shell, Ben Van Beurden, recently said that with the right mix of policy and innovation, he sees global demand for oil peaking in the early 2030s or even a bit earlier. He also mentioned that his next car will be electric. And so I'd like to thank our guest, Harry Brekelmans, for taking time from his schedule to join us today to talk about how Shell is approaching the climate change and clean energy from the perspectives of business strategy, R&D programs, and engagement with MIT and other institutions. Moderating today's conversation with Harry is Robert Armstrong, Director of the MIT Energy Initiative. Bob has been a member of the MIT faculty since 1973, and he served as head of the Department of Chemical Engineering from 1996 to 2007. Bob was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 2008. He has led the MIT Energy Initiative since 2013 and co-founded MIT 10 years ago with Professor Ernie Moniz. I'd like to thank Bob and the team at MIT for hosting today's discussion. Through its 8 low-carbon energy centers, MIT is one of the Institute's core partners on climate and clean energy. I'm grateful to MIT for playing this key role. And now I'd like to hand it over to Bob to come up and introduce Harry and to begin today's discussion. Harry, welcome to MIT.
You can take a short step there, right? So thank you very much, Maria, for the nice introduction and the framing for the conversation. And it's great to see so many faces from familiar faculty and students on campus and some new students and faculty. I saw you mostly before I got up here. I can't see very much now, I confess. As Maria mentioned, we work with industry members in a lot of our energy program at MIT. It's been a core tenet of the Energy Initiative since we launched that we needed to work with the energy industry in order to gain from their wisdom and their experience in identifying key problems as we go through this difficult transition. And also to partner with them in taking solutions we develop and getting those out into the marketplace at scale. And it's an enormous scale that we need to achieve in the energy sector. Shell's relationship with MIT goes back to 2010 when they joined MIT as a founding member. They've supported a multitude of projects in many, many different areas, including some of the studies we've done looking at where some of the energy system is going, the utility of the future study. For example, they are a sponsor of the future of nuclear energy study that's currently underway. So we're very appreciative for the support and engagement around not just specific research technologies, but also systems thinking and where we're moving. I'd like to say just a few more words about Harry and his current role and his past history. He's since 2014 been the Projects and Technology Director and a member of the Executive Committee of Royal Dutch Shell. As such, he oversees an organization that delivers Shell's major oil and gas projects and provides support on an ongoing basis to operating assets and drives technological and commercial innovation for Shell. The Projects and Technology Group also provides functional leadership in areas such as engineering, contracts and procurement, and IT, as well as safety and environment work. His group does engineering, procurement, construction companies, works with those groups, and integrated service contractors, and also collaborates with groups like Mighty, other NGOs, educational institutions around the world. Harry began his career at Shell in 1990 in the R&D department in exploration and production. I believe that was a natural. He came out of Delft University as a graduate in petroleum engineering. He's a member of the Executive Committee of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So he gives a lot of his free time for some of the same issues we're talking about here today from a business and research perspective. So it's great to have you here, and I add my thanks to Maria's for your taking your time to come and share your ideas with us. We've already been exploiting Harry's presence we got a group of graduate students with him earlier and a group of faculty just at lunch, and I'm looking forward to this continued conversation here. For Q&A, you'll notice when you sat down, or if you didn't, if you look underneath where you're sitting, there's a card. The idea is that as the conversation's going on, if questions come to mind, please jot them down and then send them to the aisle, whichever aisle is closest, and we'll have people come pick those up during the talk and then pass them up front here so we can ask a variety of different questions when we get to the end of the formal conversation. So keep those questions in mind and please feed those forward. So to start, let me go back to the title here. If you had $1 billion to invest in energy R&D, how would you spend it? And I have to say personally, I'd love to have that challenge personally. And I'll go back to something that Maria mentioned, which is some quotes by Shell CEO Ben van Beurden. He did a piece with NPR back in May, and he was quoted there as saying, "We believe climate change is real. We believe that the world needs to go through an energy transition to prevent a very significant rise in global temperatures. And we need to be part of that solution in making it happen." And so a question to start with is how do you take that statement and translate that down into your R&D portfolio? How does that guide you in how you spend $1 billion in energy R&D?
Thanks, Bob. Let me first thank you and Maria for affording the opportunity to speak here. I think we can never do enough engagement, but we certainly come to the conclusion that we need to do much more of that, in different places, different people. So, once again, it's great to have the opportunity to speak here. And to your question, if I may, maybe just to provide a bit of context and outline the landscape within which we make those decisions and we decide on how to spend that $1 billion. First and foremost, if I listen to Ben's comments, we have long acknowledged the relationship between climate change and emissions. We've made that rather instrumental or central to our scenario work, and some of you may actually be familiar with that every so often, every 3 to 4 years, we produce a scenario publication that is the result of analysis and engagement with many people external to Shell around future pathways for the planet with respect to energy, supply, demand, and the associated consequences and relationships with economy, social and cultural developments, and of course the environmental implications. And we use that as a frame for our strategy and subsequently for investment decisions, including R&D. And for some years already, of course, we've been aware of the energy transition. And I guess the emphasis Ben is providing is, well, it's accelerating. And so it's time to act, even more so than before. Some of you may be aware that in the past we made significant investments in wind, in solar, in biofuels. Not all of them equally successful. So again, to your point, it's very important how you spend the billion and how you frame that decision making. Ben again is right, pointing at electricity as one of the major trends at this point in time. If you then look at that landscape and say, what are the givens or what are the things that are maybe surrounded with a little less uncertainty, then electrification is one of the big trends. And indeed, Ben's next car will be electrical. But what he also says time and again is that fossil fuels will remain a significant part of the energy mix for decades to come. So his next car is a hybrid, not a full EV. And I know because my car also will be a hybrid because we're changing the corporate fleet. But joking aside, I think it's to testify to the fact that for some time to come, we feel that electrical and fossil fuel, renewable electrical and fossil fuel related energy supply will have to cohabitate. Now, electrification, as you well know, is 20% of the total primary energy supply. So there's a significant proportion of energy either in transportation or in heavy industry or used for other means that is not so easily electrified. And we'll again have to rely on oil and gas for some years to come. And this is where it starts to inform our R&D program. And then the other point I'll put on the map is that we have concluded that this will be a multi-decade transition, and it is surrounded with many uncertainties. So, it's a tough climate to make investment decisions in. If you are not financially robust through that transition, then you're going to be at significant risk because you will not be able to bear some of the decisions and the uncertainties to the extent they will impact your bottom line. So we've decided that profitability and fundamentally being a very solid investment opportunity is prime and key. And as a result of that, we also need to focus on our current business and its robustness. And so when you look at our R&D program, it's almost bifocal. There's an enormous amount of focus on the near term and the existing business, and then there's a very significant focus on the long term and the future requirements and products. Examples, much of our near-term research is focused on rapid deployability, to take established products and technologies in other industries, whether they be automotive or aerospace, even the medical industry, and see how we can transfer them rapidly into our existing businesses. We rely more on our supplies and supply chain to be able to source technologies. And they are more focused than before on lowering cost and increasing reliability. Now, of course, the one other thing that was quite relevant over the last few years that happened was, well, oil price fell from near 100 to around about 40, and we're only slowly coming back up, and we'll probably be range bound at lower levels for some time to come. So resilience and reliability is incredibly important. So we have had to redress our R&D program quite a bit towards that nearer term, cost-focused, reliability-focused set of investments. Meanwhile, though, last point I'll make is we have also ramped up our long-range research program, increased the scale of it, and deepened I think the sophistication, simply to be able to also keep pace with the accelerating transition. And I can give you some insights and examples there too.
Yeah, so you mentioned the forays into wind and solar and biofuels earlier, and you've mentioned this multi-decadal look or set of windows in your research portfolio. How has that changed? Say, what did that portfolio look like a decade or two ago versus now, versus what do you think it might look like in 10 or 20 years from now? So that very long range work, I mean, your view of that now is different than it was, I suspect, 15 years ago.
Yes, indeed. And I would say a bigger proportion at the time was focused on our existing business with a multi-decade outlook. So whilst we still invest in seismic imaging and geophysical R&D, again, we are more focused on specific basins and somewhat nearer term improvements. We're relying more on supply chain to be able to develop these. We are still spending a lot in our gasification area because we believe gas is a solution and a product for the long term. But you'll find us spending less money on R&D related to multi-decade oil and oil-related technologies. We also have seen a shift in our long-range research towards, for example, methane conversion, energy storage. These were not part of our investment portfolios, say, 10 years ago or so. So it's almost as if you're starting to more bimodalize the portfolio into these two brackets. And I think the other thing that changed, which I alluded to and is quite significant, is the way we do R&D. So we are much more open-minded around open innovation. And so the point you made around our cooperation and our collaboration with MIT, I think is absolutely fundamental. And we do likewise with other institutions, simply because we know we can't do it ourselves and alone. And much of the development and breakthroughs in fundamental science is actually happening here and other institutions, so we want to benefit from it. We've had a tendency in the past to maybe second guess or be too single-minded around what our suppliers can do. We're becoming more open-minded on involving them in co-developing R&D. And we're also deploying new ways to stimulate and scale that R&D. So I visited this morning our Shell Technology Works campus, which is located here at Kendall Square, and we see some friends in the audience. And the thing there is, we are hiring people that have no former and prior experience with the oil and gas industry, but come from aerospace or from automotive or other industries, and have an incredible knack for innovation. We actually separate them from the bigger Shell system, and their charge and their mandate is you will innovate relentlessly by taking other technologies from other industries, and you'll bring them about in our own operations. And this morning, again, I saw some brilliant examples. We have that. We have a technology ventures organization, and we have programs like our Game Changer program, which has been around for, I think, 20 years now, where we seed invest in crazy ideas and bring them to the next stage gate. And so the change also is that we're deploying many more of these tools and methodologies to how we innovate. And I think you wouldn't see that in the billion, but you would see it in the outcome.
Yeah. So you see your workforce, it sounds like, changing today by bringing in different kinds of disciplines to somewhat separate organizations. Do you see that penetrating into the core of Shell's R&D effort in the near future?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And probably not fast enough. Diversity in that respect is hugely important, and we all conclude every year that we're not moving fast enough in that regard. How do you create an organization that is dynamic, prone to change, inviting change, that embraces diversity, that leans very much on the external world? If I remember, and I've been with Shell 27 years, what that organization looked like and felt like 15 years ago, it wasn't that. It was almost the opposite of it. I think we made progress. I gave some examples, and I think when you look at Julie's organization, it is a very diverse, very, very dynamic, innovation-focused organization. But that's not the same across the entirety of our technology landscape. We opened a campus in Bangalore in India earlier this year, where we have almost 1,000 technologists working. And again, that is a place where it's starting to really happen. very much focused on ideation. It's an incubator. And I think our work isn't done until we have all of Shell and its ecosystem working like that, but I think it's some years away.
Yeah. So Bangalore is a nice segue to developing countries. You talked about Bangalore as a place to use talent and workforce to look at global Shell issues. But as we know, most of the energy demand growth in the coming decades will be in the developing world.
That's right.
So does Shell approach developing countries differently than it approaches developed countries, the EU, the US, for example? What is your strategy there, and how do you see your approach?
Well, we're a global company, so in some ways we approach things in generic, universal ways. But that's at the level of we have gas, we have oil, and then I would say almost every country is different in terms of how we need to craft the propositions. Developing countries have unique features, and so when you talk about access to energy, you're very familiar with the numbers. 1 billion people have no access to energy whatsoever. 3 billion people have no access to reliable energy, and so it's a huge number, mostly in developing countries. I would say in developing countries we have more of a range of propositions where, on the one hand, through our foundation, the Shell Foundation, we're promoting projects in distributed energy provision. We're promoting projects around clean cook stoves. So 3 million people in developed countries are cooking over smoke-generating devices in whatever way. And if you look at the implications to their health, it is absolutely dramatic. And providing means and ways for people to acquire clean cook stoves and then ensuring that they use them well, we have done for years through our Shell Foundation, and we feel is a great way to help these societies. But that's of course something that would not come into question in developed countries. We are working in particularly Nigeria and India. In Nigeria, through an organization called OLON, to provide microcredits and stimulate startups who are in different states and provinces in Nigeria providing off-grid energy solutions. It's not something that we see as a business that we can run at scale. We will provide many handicaps and we wouldn't have the skills to do it. But to be able to provide the seed funding and help scaling the smaller startups that are doing that, we feel is a very worthwhile thing to do. And then from there, you move up the ladder to saying, we do have a role in providing solutions at scale, either at the city level or at the national or the state level, in helping to develop the gas infrastructure, providing the supply, and we'll continue to do it. And last but not least, in a way where we create market demand. So a country like Myanmar or Vietnam, who are at the earliest stages of deciding their energy roadmap, for them to decide to use gas rather than coal will make a huge difference in the future. And so we want to play a role in engaging with the government to say what is the right choice to make. Now you would say, well, they have to say renewables. But of course, we all know that intermittency, cost, and other factors are still some of the fundamental handicaps with respect to deployment at scale of renewables, and that actually the combination of gas and renewable can be very effective. So the engagement in a country to say, if you would, in your energy roadmap, rely very significantly on gas and renewables for your electrification, you can go a long way as a country. And think about, if you look at the population of Vietnam and what they have ahead of themselves, 30 years from now, we could be either in one place, and I think it could be, for the world, a very productive and positive place. But if we just leave it to chance, the chance that the coal will actually make a significant part of that energy mix are significant, and I think we would regret that in 30 years. So we also feel we have a role there. So at different levels, we try and have an impact.
Yeah. So as you look at your strategies in different parts of the world, developing versus developed countries, at the top of all this, you have a set of shareholders you answer to. You have to provide value to them. So how does Shell as a company think about this balance between continuing to provide shareholder value on the one hand, and on the other, the goals you have of providing energy in a clean way to the world going forward?
Yeah, it's a really important question, Bob. And
any advice you can give us in the U.S. in particular would be appreciated.
I'll scratch my head and see if I do that. But I think this question is something that I think is a challenge for all of us. All our peers I know also struggle with this. Where, I said earlier, fundamentally in this uncertain and incredibly important transition, robustness is key and resilience is key. It's for a reason that governments are now asking and financial institutions us to demonstrate our resilience, because they know there'll be very significant changes in the years to come, and of course they want to provide some reassurance to investors that they can still invest in companies like us, and not only that the entirety of the financial system will not become unstable. And have we not seen some examples in past years? So we have decided fundamentally that robustness is absolutely key, and of course that is a discussion we have on an ongoing basis with our shareholders. And I think it's important for us to embrace that, or at least engage on it. We generate a significant dividend every year. We provide a dividend of something like $15 to $16 billion that we return to our shareholders, who rely on that dividend. And of course, our shareholders are pension funds, insurance companies, and so they then, of course, cycle that money back into society in very small parcels. And so it makes the world go around, and is a fundamental part of the resilience of society and our communities. So for us to say, well, we decided that was no longer important, and the only thing to do is to do what is right for the world. With that, we take significant risks, and for the sake of argument, we would invest a significant proportion of our investment budget into renewables with very low returns, very high uncertainty, and 3 years from now we'd come to regret it, and we'd have to explain to our shareholders there's no more dividend. Just think of the dislocation in the financial system, in, of course, the various causes they support. And I don't think that is often brought to the attention of people when we get into this debate around, well, you should simply decide tomorrow to divest from fossil fuels. I mean, these are fundamental, complex, and important questions to address. So we feel we need to make that shift deliberately and thoughtfully over time. So if your question is, are you going to invest in renewables? Absolutely. We committed to 700 megawatt of a wind park in the Netherlands early this year at significant investment, and there will be more of these decisions to come. But we will make them only in the face of robustness and clarity on the economic path, because we need to continue to be resilient. And if we do so, we will actually be a leader in that transition. But of course, very much in the presence of meeting the responsibilities we have to our shareholders and our broader fiduciary duties. Is that in complete contradiction with leadership? No, I don't think it is. I think we show leadership in many different ways. One, by engaging in that debate. Secondly, by committing to Paris. Thirdly, by supporting, you're aware of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. It's G20 initiatives, very important in a way it will operationalize this question around show us resilience. We have supported that. We're working actively with them. So in each and every step of the way, and I think at each relevant forum, Shell will want to be a voice and a leader, but also a voice that calls for reason and doesn't altogether dismiss and leave the economic principles that also make for growth and development in this planet. So I think that's the point we would always want to make.
So given this desire to satisfy shareholders and also look to the future, what do you see as some of the biggest strategic opportunities for Shell right now?
Yeah, and I'm very optimistic about that. So if I just take that that very present prospect of electrification and a growing share of power in the overall energy mix, then you combine it with the developments in digital and the notion that many of the solutions are there to serve individual customers. So when it deals with mobility or the way power is being provided, you will find that over time we'll get closer to individual propositions and customers. And away from these very significant point source solutions that maybe Shell for, big refineries, big plants, or big utilities. And well, we can do both. And we're seeing great opportunity in the sort of consumer-focused end of the business, For example, through our retail business. I mentioned earlier today to you that we have 33,000 retail stations globally. There is no retailer with that many outlets, no one. And we have 30 million customer contacts every day. We are increasingly in conversations with these customers around energy as a proposition. And we can provide them energy in the form of power and electricity, in the form of fuel for their transport, and what else? We have a fantastic trading capability. So we can also help them to find ways to get the best economic proposition by integrating renewables with more traditional sources. And so we feel we are extremely well positioned to be able to move to the future and offer people a much more diversified, much more sustainable energy proposition. In fact, the folks here in Kendall Square and Julie in our organization and some other people that have joined them are actually working on the connected consumer, which is really leveraging the digital world and the physical world in terms of providing offerings. And so you may not hear a lot about it, you may not see a lot about it, but under the surface there's enormous amounts of work going on to ensure we're future fit.
Great. So one of the challenges, seems to me, and many in the area, is that quite a few low carbon technologies, CCUS in particular, really need a price on carbon to succeed. And yet we don't anywhere in the world have a robust price on carbon. There are some pricing systems. So what is Shell's outlook there? How do you see the need for a price on carbon, the likelihood of that happen? How do you design your business plans and your R&D strategy in the absence of that price now and in the uncertainty about when it might happen?
I think we are very disciplined around it internally, where we work with the price on carbon. We have actually differentiated pricing on carbon with respect to our capital allocation and our investment decisions and when we look forward in our business plans. We have advocated for many years for a carbon price, some shape or form, and reinforcing your point that it is emerging. There are countries that have an escalating carbon price, but we need a lot more than that. And in the absence of that, I think technologies like carbon capture that we will desperately need are not finding the momentum that they deserve. And so that's a real dilemma. I think we spoke about that earlier today with some of us. And we want to continue to show leadership in still driving for those solutions. And I do believe, and I'm optimistic, that over time, I think this will become more of an accepted notion that the world will not get to zero emissions, but the world can get to net zero emissions, and at which point you need absorption, an offset, and carbon capture. But meanwhile, we don't have enough in the way of a carbon price to do that. We're continuing to fund R&D with respect to carbon capture and carbon usage, amongst others here and in a variety of other places in the world. The fundamental research as well as the individual projects. And I see an increasing momentum also with our peers. Amongst others, under the umbrella of the OGCI, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, where we've committed $1 billion in climate-related R&D and investment. And 50% of that money is going to carbon capture and usage. So I'm optimistic that we're seeing a groundswell now happening that I hope also eventually will end up in part here, because here's the fundamental work that is going on. So I'm moderately optimistic. But we will need that price over time.
Yeah. So you haven't mentioned hydrogen yet.
Yeah.
You're a fuel company. So where do you see hydrogen in your future as a storage medium or as a transportation fuel? Do you have an image of that as a corporation, or is it still very exploratory?
Well, I guess it's still exploratory in that sense, but we remain committed to it. So when you look at our long-range research, hydrogen is part of it. So biofuel is part of it. Hydrogen is part of it. These connected customer solutions part of it. Methane conversion, dense energy carriers, and storage. They're all components, and we've been quite public about that. And we are continuing to make progress in hydrogen, amongst others in Germany. Germany has, I think, been the country where you've seen most commitment in terms of government support and funding. And we're now working towards a network of between 300 and 400 retail stations by 2022 in northern Germany that will provide hydrogen at industrial or commercial scale to customers. And of course, there is a fleet of cars accompanying that. And so we're working with some of the OEMs to drive that project. And so I think there will be countries where hydrogen will be a solution, but it wouldn't be a universal global solution. And likewise, and to your point, there will be other ways where we can deploy hydrogen, either in storage or in conversion, in ways that I think we will help to drive the decarbonization journey. But once again, like many others, this is not the one single answer that people need to appeal to and say, well, if you stop doing all these other things, but we do this, then the problem will go away. I think we need to get acquainted with the notion that we need to drive a multitude of solutions that will come together in different ways in different countries. And if we can just embrace that, we can actually get a long, long way.
Good. You willing to tell us what new technologies we're going to see coming out of Shell in the next 5 or 10 years? What's going to really surprise us?
Yeah, I think it's hard to point at individual products. There'll be many, and they'll range from, maybe just kind of speaking to some of the developments here, but we're doing a lot of great work on our catalysts. So the continuous improvement of our catalysts and the way they impact our chemicals business, hugely important. So I think in our plastics and polycarbonates, there'll be some products that will hit the market in the coming years that I think will also be quite important in the decarbonization journey. I'd certainly hope that we can make progress in carbon capture in the coming years, and that will play an important role in that. But the other thing is, truly in the digital space, the coming together of our current offerings and some of our future offerings together or packaged in a digital wrapping, I think is where you're going to see quite prominent progress. And then last but not least, I mentioned earlier, wind or solar, there will be investments. And I choose these four because I think they'll speak to people, because they'll be nearer term, they will be demonstrating progress. And behind that, some of the work that we're doing together, biosynthesis, you're leading in that space as well, and it's going to be hugely important. Electrochemistry, fields we're really interested in. Nanomaterials, those are not individual products, but I think those technologies will start showing up in where we invest and how we work together with you, amongst others.